I'd like to start my paper today with an article from the Argentine music periodical La Gazzetta Musicale. Entitled E el Otello and Otello, it appeared in early February 1887 and was the latest in a series of reports in La Gazzetta Musicale and other Argentine publications speculating upon the premiere of Giuseppe Verdi's Otello at Milan's La Scala Theatre. In Milan, that is the heart and mind of Italian musical art, they were awaiting the first performance of Otello as a real event that will have an echo in the whole world, declared the author. What will have happened? That is the question that we have heard in our artistic circles, whose people are eager to hear of the success of Otello. We are hoping, then, to hear soon of the success of the work that has for such time had at its feet the expectations of the whole musical and artistic world. Key to this anticipation was the sound of the telegram, whose crackling into life promised to provide a metonym of Otello's global echo. Quote, "It's for this reason as well that we are waiting for the electric lead to speak," commented the author. Several days have passed, however, and we haven't yet heard its word. This sense of intimate, intense listening draws together the anticipation of the La Scala audience with Argentine opera lovers in the experience of simultaneity. At one level, of course, it's hard to overlook the pathetic contrast between Otello's imagined mighty operatic presence and the telegram's feeble crackle, a form of connection that moreover risks positioning Buenos Aires as a mere echo of Milan. Yet the anthropomorphic language of the telegram speaking also points to an entwinement of the human and the mechanical in bringing opera across the Atlantic, of machines imagined as human, and machines bringing news of subjective reactions to opera, an idea of mechanical reproduction thoroughly mediated by the individual. The telegram thus prefigures the eventual arrival of the opera itself, and perhaps offers ways of imagining operatic transfer more generally. This kind of way of talking about the telegram was hardly unique to Buenos Aires. Historian Roland Wenzelhumer has explored this trope in his study of 19th century communications technology, and more recently, theatre scholar Marlis Schweitzer has discussed the idea of telegraphic performance in relation to Broadway performances. For Schweitzer, this denotes the ways in which human behaviour became entrained to the high-speed rhythms of new technology in the early 20th century. What I want to do in this paper instead is to use the notion of the telegram speaking to open up some questions about operatic listening in Buenos Aires in the late 19th century, and in particular, the ways it engaged with the interplay between mechanical reproduction and human agency in operatic staging. More specifically, I want to focus upon the early reception of Verdi's Otello in Buenos Aires to begin to open up the historically and geographically specific modes of listening at the time, and the relation they bore to the changing systems of operatic production and reception that marked Italian opera. The arrival of Otello in Buenos Aires, I want to suggest, was a particularly revealing moment in late 19th century Italian operatic culture, a moment when an opera on the move met a city whose position on the global pecking order was firmly on the way up. As E el Otello made clear, the premiere of Otello in Milan in February 1887 was a celebrated media event, one that brought journalists from all over Europe and the Americas. Reviewing the 20th performance, for example, a date picked to allow for assessment of the music away from the surrounding media excitement, Edouard Hanslick observed, "It is a remarkable sign of the times that the most prominent newspapers in France, England, Germany, and even America sent their own correspondents to Milan in the midst of winter in order to report the success of Otello, and even sent telegrams after each act. Where else has anything happened like that before?" End quote. Ricordi's efforts to preserve this event to posterity, an event that moreover prompted rhetoric of the technological sublime from many Milanese critics, were evident in the mass of special editions produced around the premiere, but extended to Ricordi collecting the reviews from Italian and foreign newspapers in a single volume. Such a move, one might say, not only sought to preserve the event for posterity, but also aimed to preserve a certain horizon of expectations around Otello, mapping out a familiar version of the operatic globe, with Milan firmly at the centre. At the same time, the unprecedentedly detailed staging manual that Ricordi produced for the opera promised authentic reproducibility when it eventually left Milan to embark on the international circuit. Soon after Milan were unfinished, Otello did indeed travel throughout several Italian cities with selected members of the original cast and reproductions of the La Scala sets, before embarking on a German language tour, mainly through provincial cities, in 1888. But the first major foreign cities to hear the work in its original language version, apart from Vienna, were New York, firstly, on a tour organised by tenor Italo Campanini in April 1888, and then Buenos Aires in June and July, with an operatic race between the Politeama Theatre, then under the management of impresario Cesare Giacchi, and then the Cologne Theatre, then managed by impresario Angelo Ferrari, and production sanctioned by the Ricordi firm, and starring the original Otello, Francesco Tommaso. The opera's quick transfer to Buenos Aires thus underlined the city's growing importance in the Italian operatic world. Already, Aida had arrived very quickly, and here I should give a nod to Annibal's recent article on this in the CHA. And by the time Otello arrived, local critics were quick to flag up the prestige of the Argentine double staging that reinforced the city's position as the Silver City, one in which impresarios could extract maximum profit from their operatic goods. This growing importance was of course tied to Buenos Aires' wider urban development from the 1870s onwards, that involved the city being remodelled as a European-style showcase under Mayor Torquato de Alvear on the back of the country's agricultural exports. This renovation in turn gave rise to the demolition of the old Colón Theatre shortly after the Otello premiere, to make way for a more grand and avowedly modern theatre that could offer an acoustic and visual counterpart to the modernity elsewhere. As social historian Ernesto Quesada complained a few years later in 1893, the older theatre's poor acoustics have been rooted in outdated theatrical practices and forced many singers to shout above the orchestral din, and in fact made large choral scenes especially popular in the city. A far cry then for the more civilised social practices being promoted by prominent officials. The city's urban growth and modernisation became a rich source of myth-making for locals and visitors alike. An article published in Sud-American newspaper during the Otello run proudly boasted that amongst all the cities of the South American continent, Buenos Aires is without doubt the one that most quickly expands, extends, widens itself, and grows in industrial, commercial, production and artistic importance. In Europe, in spite of the grand constructions, in spite of the new and spacious streets that are opening in the midst of the old ones, in spite of the transformations achieved with relative activity in Paris, in Marseille, in Barcelona, and in Milan and other cities, there are no examples of a development so great and so quick. The 1887 census likewise proudly recorded the forward strides of the city of Argentina have become the admiration of people in modern times, and have moreover given rise to winter seasons at the elite theatres. As it reached its conclusion, the census could not resist asking, what will become of this great city of Buenos Aires within 50 years? Yet if the remodelling of Buenos Aires on broadly European lines was intended to signal the city's modernity and urban sophistication, by the late 1880s such changes had themselves already become canonical, a kind of reproducible modernity familiar and historically resonant by the time Otello arrived on the stage, and that moreover remained wedded to a neo-colonial conception of progress. Nothing could illustrate this more succinctly, perhaps, than this picture taken in an Argentine school in 1889. I'm afraid the picture is dire quality, but you will see a platform in the corner which has written on it, Paris is the centre of the world. Indeed, French-Argentine writer Émile Darío's account of the city, life and habits in La Plata, written for French audiences in the 1880s and translated back into Spanish at the request of the President, circle around precisely this uncanny aspect of the city, not simply its dizzying transformation, but also its unsettling replication of cultural tropes found elsewhere. In the months preceding the Otello productions, in June and July 1888, efforts to transfer the opera over quickly ran up against similar questions of cultural transfer. These questions were raised firstly in response to band arrangements of extracts from Otello that circulated throughout the city. What fate will Otello have in America? Cried La Gazzetta Musicale, in response to this unseemly mediation of Otello before its local premiere. The operatic race between the Politiamo and the Colón, moreover, became embroiled in questions regarding copyright status in the Americas, a debate that gave rise to parodies in journals such as El Mosquito. When the first production arrived at the Politiamo in early June, in a pirated but textually accurate version starring tenor Roberto Stagno and soprano Romilda Pantaleone, the Desdemona at La Scala, Jackie was quick to emphasise that costumes and sets of the shows had been imported from Milan, and that the production was an authentic representation of the La Scala staging, an assertion that unsurprisingly came mired in scepticism. Rehearsals had lasted over a month, Jackie said, necessary for such a complex piece of the modern school, in which the orchestration was so important. And yet reviews from the Argentine premiere also paid close attention to the opera's historical position, as an opera expected to be Verdi's final operatic work that also came as a ready canonised instant classic. Writing in El Nacional, for example, one local critic exclaimed that I've attended a grandiose spectacle, the meeting of two geniuses across 3 centuries, stretching out their hands. Neither a critic nor a historian. There, when I listen to Verdi's Otello, as I listen to Traviata today, I will have to be calm to judge, according to my modest criteria, obeying that intimate counsellor that each carries within their own conscience. Listening to Otello at this moment, then, is suffused with anticipations of future encounters of the work, a point at which it will be as canonical as Traviata, and at which time its disruption of historical time will be furthered by temporal distance. This awareness of an opera's canonic position, and what Flora Wilson has elegantly dubbed canonic listening, was of course hardly new by the late 1880s, And indeed, as John Rosselli has argued, the notion of an operatic canon was arguably more firmly entrenched in Latin America than Europe by the mid to late 19th century. Yet these anxieties about passing judgment on the opera, and this sense of anticipation about its future, only became more pronounced as performances wore on. Many reviewers were reticent to offer specific pronouncements on the opera, too overwhelmed by the writings that had surrounded Otello in previous months, and too cautious about whether the local staging could match Verdi's own imagination. The emergence of this kind of detailed musical criticism in Argentina in the 1870s was in that sense confounded by the pressures of mediation, of a work already too overdetermined by previous writings, that left writers anxious about giving a verdict in light of the celebrity of the Milan premiere. And yet when the Cologne production, supported by recording and featuring Tamagno's Otello, finally arrived, such anxieties did not disappear. Describing the dress rehearsal, for example, El Nacional complained that describing how Tamagno interprets and sings Otello is difficult because the written word can't paint exactly certain intimate impressions of the heart. Otello has this great defect. There is not more than one Tamagno capable of rendering it with all the force required by the literary drama and the musical drama. Other reviewers were quick to echo such sentiments, expressing anxiety about the opera's scope of future performance. Tamagno, the only interpreter who nowadays can cope with this opera, observes Sudamerica. Tamagno appeared, and from his first phrases the public were made aware that they were in front of an unknown Otello, that is to say, in front of the real Otello. For La Nation, attending Tamagno's Otello therefore took on historical urgency, as the tenor's familiarity in the city could still not guarantee a future realignment of the operatic stars. Quote, Tamagno is transformed, and all this results in a great assembly that one should take advantage of this year in case we don't hear it again. End quote. Tamagno's performances thus offered a transcendent aesthetic experience that was paradoxically at odds with the opera's canonic status, and indeed its present-day involvement in the operatic culture industry. If Otello arrived already canonised in a reproducible form, then Tamagno was at once central to the opera's reception, yet problematically irreconcilable with its historical position. As such, commentators in Buenos Aires on Tamagno's performances might seem to anticipate Peggy Phelan's celebrated claim that performance's only life is in the present, that, quote, performance clogs the smooth machinery of reproductive representation necessary to the circulation of capital, end quote. Listening to Otello, then, involved an essential, yet ultimately inexpressible task, the generation of collective auditory memory that could compensate for the tenor's ephemeral voice in the future. And yet these assertions about Tamagno's inimitability were not naive. Rather than just gesturing to the opera's future performance history, local critics were also anxious about how their encounter with Otello was already always mediated by earlier writings. What can one say of the great Tamagno, lamented El Censor? You will find this artist shielded from criticism. The influence of his fame and the memory of all that the Italian press has said in praise of him regarding his creation of Otello will protect him, end quote. Uniquely equipped though Tamagno was in the role, the tenor's long-standing familiarity in Buenos Aires also made it apparent how much he had gained from Verdi's interventions during rehearsals. Tamagno will be simply admirable, declared La Patria. This part, written for him, for his extraordinary vocal resources, suits him more perhaps than any other. It is easily understood that Tamagno performs wonders in this role. It was written for him, and he was taught it by Maestro Verdi himself, end quote. The issue of Tamagno's influence over the composition of Otello unfortunately extends beyond this paper, as does the later reception of these Argentine reviews of Otello in the Italian press. But in important ways, this awareness of the Milanese reception and Tamagno's training also brought into question the state of Tamagno's own liveliness and agency, anxieties that had in fact not been voiced in the earlier Milanese press. As a performer, that is, whose success was predetermined, and who arrived enmeshed in media hype, a singer in short, thoroughly embedded in the commodity culture that his live presence seemed to purport. These tensions surrounding Otello's future performance thus echoed concerns voiced widely by critics in Buenos Aires about the city's role in the future of Italian opera, a culture above all of reproduction and performance, in which they were on the receiving end of the Italian operatic industry, and yet also racing ahead in global terms. What emerges from this critical reception, I would suggest, is on the one hand a sensitivity to the opera's mediality and the implications of this for the future, a sense not only that Otello will continue to live beyond the critic, but also of the critic's duty to record certain dimensions of the work that will inevitably vanish, and thus a concern for its status as performance. At the same time, however, Reviewers in Buenos Aires also revealed the preoccupation with the weight of previous writings and imagined performances on their own perceptions of the work. And indeed a sense in which Tamagno himself operated both as a marker of ephemerality within the performance and as a sign of its mediatization, a product of Verdi's craft, who had arguably also left his own ghostly signature upon Verdi's enduring work. What these reviews ultimately suggest, I would argue, is a sensitivity to what Benjamin Pickett and Jason Staniek have dubbed deadness, a mutually effective co-labouring between past and present, and that for Pickett and Staniek describes the, quote, distended temporalities and spatialities of all performance, much the same way that all ontologies are really hauntologies, end quote. While Pickett and Staniek's focus is broadly upon late capitalism and late 20th century recording technology, such a terminology nonetheless seems particularly well suited to late 19th century Italian operatic culture, a world, that's to say, in which performance is largely centred upon past works, in which new works come mediated by mechanical communications networks and the distant voices they transmit, and in which a work such as Otello will almost inevitably be repeated ad infinitum. Listening to Tamagno, then, is to hear a voice that will vanish and which needs to be recorded for posterity, one that Verdi has moreover already somehow inscribed into the work. Performances of Otello thus revealed themselves as a kind of interface with deadness, in which anxieties about future performance were also shadowed by the presence of the past. Tamagno's Otello was at once problematically ephemeral and an emblem of repetition, a moment of performance ontologically embedded in a reproductive economy. As such, I would suggest, the productions of Otello both offer a lens on concerns surrounding operatic listening in late 19th century Buenos Aires, but they also point towards tensions surrounding Italian opera's own mediality by the late 19th century, between notions of mobility and reproduction and the ephemerality of theatre itself, of opera as both a reproducible commodity and perennially on the move, needing to be remade at every moment. While the concerns voiced in these Argentine reviews are at one level geographically specific and reflective of what we might call, following Stephen Fell, a particular epistemology in Buenos Aires, this focus upon Tamagno and Otello's mediality might also be productively pursued, I would say, in relation to Otello's own dramaturgy. In her recent monograph, Alessandra Campana explores the theme of theatrical acting in Otello, suggesting that Iago is the embodiment of the opera's own theatrical art. The Act 1 love duet, by contrast, reminds us, in Campana's view, of a more authentic form of mimesis between Desdemona and Otello. Yet the focus on Tamagno and Otello in these Argentine reviews might encourage us to see Otello himself as a perennial locus for concerns about deadness and agency within operatic production at this moment, residing precisely within the tension between presence and the reproduction of gesture, between autonomous agent and inanimate puppet. The Act 1 love duet, after all, describes Otello's own seduction of Desdemona through the construction of narrative, a move that evokes sighs and tears in his interlocutor, the usual embodied trait of operatic experience. The role of the handkerchief in the opera, the gift from Otello to Desdemona that proves central to Iago's plot, might moreover seem an emblem of the opera's own theatrical status, a material entity transformed into the prop for Iago's theatrical machine, yet also a unique object within Otello's imagination, something that serves as a metonym of Desdemona's purity. This material stuff of theatre becomes laden with promise as the opera proceeds, moving from a banal, even comic material accessory to an otherworldly object, in Cassio's words, a charming miracle. Rather than a passive echo of Milan, then, perhaps Buenos Aires and its critics might instead reveal themselves as key voices in recovering the ontologies and anxieties of late 19th century performance, the tanagram's feeble word, a resonant symbol for the making and remaking of opera.